Resident Evil is a 1996 survival horror video game developed and published by Capcom originally for the PlayStation. It is the first title in Capcom's Resident Evil franchise. Players control Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, members of the elite task force STARS, who must escape a mansion infested with zombies and other monsters. Conceived by producer Tokuro Fujiwara as a remake of his earlier horror game Sweet Home, 1989, the development of Resident Evil was led by Shinji Mikami. It went through several redesigns, first as Super NES game in 1993, then a fully 3D first-person PlayStation game in 1994 and finally a third-person game. Gameplay consists of action, exploration, puzzle solving and inventory management. Resident Evil establishes many conventions seen later in the series, including the control scheme, inventory system, save system, and use of 3D models superimposed over pre-rendered backgrounds. Resident Evil was praised for its graphics, gameplay, sound, and atmosphere, although it received criticism for its voice acting. It was an international bestseller, and became the best-selling PlayStation game ever at the time. By December 1997, it had sold about 4 million copies worldwide and had grossed more than $200 million, equivalent to $346 million in 2021. Resident Evil is often cited as one of the most influential and greatest video games. It is credited with defining the survival horror genre and with returning zombies to popular culture, leading to a renewed interest in zombie films by the 2000s. It created a franchise including video games, films, comics, novels, and other merchandise. It has been ported to Sega Saturn, Windows and Nintendo DS. In 2002, a Resident Evil remake was released for the GameCube and ported to other platforms in 2015. A sequel, Resident Evil 2, was released in 1998, and a prequel, Resident Evil 0, in 2002. The player's character is a member of a special law enforcement task force who is trapped in a mansion populated by dangerous mutated creatures. The objective of the game is to uncover the mystery of the mansion and ultimately escape alive. The game's graphics consist of real-time 3D polygonal characters and objects, superimposed over pre-rendered backdrops with fixed camera angles. The player controls the character by pushing the D-pad or analog stick left or right to rotate the character and then move the character forward or backwards by pushing the D-pad up or down, tank controls. To fulfill the game's objective, the player uncovers various documents that provide exposition about the game's narrative, as well as clues that help them solve various puzzles within the mansion. Key items are also available that give the player access to other items or new areas. The player can arm their character with weapons to defend themselves from enemies, although the ammunition available for each firearm is limited and the player must learn to conserve the ammunition they have for situations where they will really need it. To restore the character's health, the player uses first aid sprays or 3 types of healing herbs that can be mixed together in different combinations for different healing effects. The carrying capacity of the player is limited depending on the character, and items that the player does not wish to carry at the moment can be stored into an item box to be retrieved for later use. To save their progress, the player must pick up an ink ribbon and use it on any of the typewriters scattered through key locations in the game. However, the supply of ink ribbons the player can acquire is limited, much like the player's ammunition and healing supplies. Players will encounter and fight various infected creatures such as flesh-eating zombies and zombie dogs, giant spiders, sharks, and other monsters. The player character is assisted by another character, Rebecca Chambers or Barry Burton, throughout the game. On July 24, 1998, when a series of bizarre murders occur on the outskirts of the fictional Midwestern town of Raccoon City, the Raccoon City Police Department's STARS team are assigned to investigate. After contact with Bravo team is lost, Alpha team is sent to investigate their disappearance. Alpha team locates Bravo team's crashed helicopter and land at the site, where they are suddenly attacked by a pack of monstrous dogs. After Alpha team's helicopter pilot, Brad Vickers, panics and takes off alone, the remaining members of the team, Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Albert Wesker, and Barry Burton, are forced to seek refuge in a nearby abandoned mansion. Depending on which character the player chooses to assume control of Chris or Jill, either Barry or Chris are separated from the rest of the team during the chase and do not make it to the mansion. The team decides to investigate the mansion to search for their missing team member. As the team members explore the mansion, they encounter dangerous creatures roaming its halls. The player character eventually learns that a series of illegal experiments were being undertaken by a clandestine research team under the supervision of biomedical company Umbrella Corporation. The creatures roaming the mansion and its surrounding areas are the results of these experiments, which have exposed the mansion's personnel and various animals and insects to a highly contagious and mutagenic biological agent known as the T-virus. The player character may also encounter several members of Bravo Team, including Enrico Marini, who reveals that one of Alpha Team's members is a traitor before being shot and killed by an unseen assailant. Eventually, the player character discovers a secret underground laboratory containing Umbrella's experiments. In the lab, the player encounters Wesker, who reveals that he is a double agent working for Umbrella, and plans to use the Tyrant, a giant humanoid supersoldier, to kill the remaining STARS members. However, in the ensuing confrontation, Wesker is supposedly killed, and the player character defeats the Tyrant. After activating the lab's self-destruct system, the player character reaches the heliport and manages to contact Brad for extraction, at which point the player may be confronted by Tyrant one last time. The game features multiple endings depending on the player's actions at key points over the course of the game. The best ending sees that the player character saves their partner, Rebecca Chambers, for Chris's campaign, and Barry for Jill's campaign, as well as a team member imprisoned in the lab, Jill for Chris's campaign, and vice versa. If at least the partner survives, the Tyrant is defeated and the mansion destroyed, otherwise the mansion remains intact and the Tyrant remains loose in the forest if the partner or team member is left to permanently die. Design Resident Evil was created by a team of staff members who would later become part of Capcom Production Studio 4. The inspiration for Resident Evil was the earlier Capcom horror game Sweet Home, 1989. Shinji Mikami was commissioned to make a game set in a haunted mansion like Sweet Home, and early on, the game was intended to be a remake of Sweet Home. The project was proposed by Sweet Home creator Tokuro Fujiwara, who was Mikami's mentor and served as the game's producer. Fujiwara said the basic premise was that I'd be able to do the things that I wasn't able to include in Sweet Home, mainly on the graphics front, and that he was confident that horror games could become a genre in themselves. He entrusted Mikami, who was initially reluctant because he hated being scared, with the project, because he understood what's frightening. Since Capcom no longer had the rights to the Sweet Home license, they had to invent a new universe, but the game still adopted many elements from Sweet Home. Resident Evil was based on Sweet Home's gameplay system, adopting many elements from the game, including the limited item inventory management, the mansion setting, the puzzles, the emphasis on survival, the door loading screen, the use of scattered notes and diary entries as storytelling mechanics, multiple endings depending on how many characters survive, backtracking to previous locations in order to solve puzzles later on, the use of death animations, individual character items such as a lockpick or lighter, restoring health through items scattered across the mansion, the intricate layout of the mansion, and the brutally horrific imagery. Part of the inspiration for limited ammunition came from the MSX port of the game Alcazar, the Forgotten Fortress, according to scenario writer Kenichi Iwao. The idea of having limited ammunition was inspired by the limited amount of supplies in the game's randomized dungeons. Iwao wanted to take more elements from the game, such as adding more ways to attack zombies with items such as mines and traps, but was unable to due to schedule constraints. Production began in 1993, and the game took 3 years to develop. During the first 6 months of development, Mikami worked on the game alone, creating concept sketches, designing characters, and writing over 40 pages of script. The project was originally planned for the Super NES, before moving development to the PlayStation in 1994. Koji Oda was working on the Super NES version, after having worked on Super Ghouls and Ghosts, 1991. Oda revealed that the setting was originally more of a hellish place, before being changed to a more realistic setting. Several of the Resident Evil mansion's pre-rendered backdrops were inspired by the Overlook Hotel, the setting for the 1980 horror film, The Shining. Mikami also cited the 1978 film Dawn of the Dead as a negative inspiration for the game. The game was initially conceived as a fully 3D first-person update of Sweet Home, influenced by the game's first-person battles, with action and shooting mechanics. A first-person prototype was produced, and initially featured a supernatural, psychological Japanese horror style similar to Sweet Home, before opting for an American zombie horror style influenced by George Romero films. During production, Mikami discovered Alone in the Dark, 1992, which influenced him to adopt a cinematic fixed-view camera system. Mikami said that, if it wasn't for Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil would have had a first-person view instead. Mikami was initially reluctant to adopt Alone in the Dark's fixed-view camera system, saying it had an effect on immersion, making the player feel a bit more detached, but eventually adopted it because the use of pre-rendered backdrops allowed a higher level of detail than his fully 3D first-person view prototype, which didn't get along so well with the original PlayStation specs. A concept art claimed to be of the original first-person prototype has been available since the 1990s, showing more similarity to Doom rather than Alone in the Dark. A first-person perspective was not used again for the mainline Resident Evil series until Resident Evil 7, Biohazard 2017. A later prototype featured cooperative gameplay, but this feature was eventually removed, as Mikami said it, technically wasn't good enough. Early footage of this co-op prototype was revealed in 1995. At this stage of development, a local co-op mode was present, along with different outfits. A later demo made for the 1995 V-Jump Festival presentation in Japan featured real-time weapon changes, with the co-op mode removed and rudimentary character models and textures. An early 1996 preview in Maximum Console magazine featured a graveyard and a slightly different version of the final boss. The graveyard, which was removed from the final game, eventually made it into the 2002 remake. Also featured in the game until late in development were guest houses and a tower, which were replaced by the guardhouse and the lab respectively. Another feature that was removed from the final game was the real-time weapon changing, from the earlier 1995 V-Jump demo. Capcom did not use any motion capture in the game, despite having their own motion capture studio. Instead, the animators referred to books and videos to study how people, spiders, and other animals encountered in the game move. In pre-production, other characters were conceived. Dewey, an African-American man, was intended to perform a comic relief role, while Gelzer, a big cyborg, was a typical, strongman, character. Both were later replaced by Rebecca and Barry, respectively. Almost all development was done on Silicon Graphics hardware using the software program Softimage. The PlayStation was chosen as the lead platform because the development team felt it was the most appropriate for the game in terms of things such as the amount of polygons. The development team had upwards of 80 people towards the end of the game's development. According to Akio Sakai, head of Capcom's consumer software division, Capcom were hesitant to port Resident Evil to the Saturn because the hardware was not as ideally suited to the game as the PlayStation, ensuring the port would take a long time. A Saturn version was finally unveiled at the April 1997 Tokyo Game Show, at which Capcom also showed a demo for the sequel on PlayStation. The live-action full-motion video sequences were filmed in Japan with a cast of American actors. All Japanese releases contain English voice acting with Japanese captions and text. However, Japanese voice performances were also recorded but were left unused, as Mikami found the quality of the performances inadequate. However, lead programmer Yasuhiro Anpo later said that, due to all of the development staff being Japanese, they were unaware of the poor localization that apparently hindered the realism and immersion of the title for the international release, which was one of the reasons for the redub in the 2002 remake. The original Japanese PlayStation version also features a vocal ending theme, Yumi de Owarasenai. I Won't Let This End as a Dream, performed by Japanese rock artist Fumitaka Fujigami, that is not in any other versions of the game. Fujiwara said the game was originally targeted towards a core audience and he only expected it to sell around 200,000 copies, before the game went on to sell millions. Mikami said he was a little worried about how well a horror game would really sell. Anpo said that Capcom did not expect the game to be successful. English localization Biohazard was renamed for the North America and Europe markets after Chris Kramer, director of communications at Capcom, pointed out that it would be impossible to trademark the name in the United States. Among others, the 1992 video game Biohazard Battle and the New York alternative metal band Biohazard were already using the name. Capcom therefore ran an internal company contest to find a new name. The name Resident Evil was settled upon since the game takes place in a mansion. Kramer thought the name was super cheesy. Can't remember what I felt was a better alternative, probably something stupid about zombies, but the rest of the marketing crew loved it and were ultimately able to convince Capcom Japan and Mikami-san that the name fit. The cover artwork for the American and European release was done by artist Bill Sienkiewicz. The original PlayStation version of Resident Evil went through several considerable changes between its original Japanese release and its international counterparts. The North American and European versions of the intro were heavily cut from the one featured in the Japanese releases. Shots of mangled corpses, a Cerberus zombie dog being shot, and Joseph's death were edited out, as well as scenes featuring the character Chris Redfield smoking a cigarette. Despite these tweaks, the game was ultimately released on the PlayStation as one of the first games to receive the mature rating from the Entertainment Software Rating Board. In the game itself, the auto-aiming function was disabled and the numbers of ink ribbons found by the player were reduced. Capcom also planned to eliminate the interconnected nature of item boxes, meaning that items could only be retrieved from the locations where they were originally stored. This change made it in preview copies of the US version, but was removed from the retail release. This particular game mechanic would resurface in the GameCube remake as part of an unlockable difficulty setting. Shinji Mikami noted that they made the American version harder at the request of the American staff so that the game could be rented and not be completed in a few days. Mikami said that this version proved fairly difficult for Capcom staff, who had to play very carefully to complete it. The original PlayStation version of Resident Evil was critically acclaimed. The Saturn version was also very well received. The director's cut was positively received as well, with most critics regarding the advanced mode and the bundled Resident Evil 2 demo as the highlights. Sales Resident Evil was a bestseller in Japan, North America, and Europe, including the United Kingdom. Shortly after release, it became the best-selling PlayStation game ever at the time. In Japan, the game sold 1.016 million units in 1996. Overseas, it topped the US charts and entered at number 2 on the UK charts. In the United States, the game sold over 1 million copies by early September 1996, becoming a system seller for the PlayStation and increasing its install base at the time. 111 in Europe, the game shipped 230,000 units on its first day of release, with 21,500 sold on its first weekend in the United Kingdom, where it was one of the fastest-selling CD releases up until then. The game went on to sell at least more than 300,000 units in Europe by December 1996. By December 1997, the game had sold about 4 million units worldwide and grossed more than $200 million, equivalent to $346 million in 2021. According to Capcom's investor relations website, the original version of Resident Evil has sold over 2.75 million copies, while the director's cut version, including the DualShock Edition, sold an additional 2.33 million copies. All PlayStation versions of the game have sold a combined 5.08 million units worldwide. Remake in 2002, Resident Evil was remade for the GameCube as part of an exclusivity agreement between Capcom and Nintendo that spanned 3 new games. The remake includes a variety of new gameplay elements, environments, and story details, as well as improved visuals and sound. The game was also later ported for the Wii in 2008. A remastered version of the remake, featuring high-definition graphics, was released as a download for the PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Windows, Xbox 360, Xbox One in 2015, with a limited edition PlayStation 3 version released at retail in Japan.